Sometimes it's better for me to just sit back, bite my tongue, and then in 4 years I'll be able to say what I want.
There has been a gradual institutionalization of this code of conduct, the effect of which is to prevent people from ventilating their views. Bright students won't put up with it.
Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith.
They stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber at Yale.
We disagree, we debate, and then at the end of the day, we remain friends.
Welcome everyone to Pod and Man at Yale. I'm the host, Ari Schaefer, Director of Communications here at the Buckley Institute. As always, I'd like to welcome back to the podcast Abhinay Lingareddy, a junior.
Hi, Ari. Thanks for having me.
And for the first time, we've got Will Flanigan, a sophomore.
Hello, good morning.
And John Byler, a freshman.
Thanks for having me, Ari.
Thanks so much for joining the podcast. Today we're going to talk about the Yale Political Union, which I think is unique on America's college campuses. Most campuses have debate teams. Like at Harvard, they have a competitive debate team. They compete against other schools. But, I didn't do a comprehensive search, but I don't know of any other school that has this kind of casual debate organization. They're more than debate teams, almost like debating frats. You hang out with your friends and argue amongst each other. So, Abhi, you're the longest tenured Yale student. Can you give us a quick walkthrough of the YPU and how it works?
Yeah. I think that was a great metaphor with the frats. I think the Yale Political Union, founded in 1934, is the oldest collegiate debating society in America. It's modeled on like Cambridge Union, Oxford Union, and the UK. And so basically it's like 7 parties, or like you were saying, 7 political frats. Might be some more fratty than others, which we might talk about in the future. But 7 parties that have their own individual debates on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and then come to debate on Tuesdays with a guest. So we've had guests this semester like Theresa May and Al Sharpton. So the guest gives a speech, and the students from multiple parties give a speech debating whoever the guest is, which is honestly quite unique. Like student speeches is something that Cambridge and Oxford Union actually doesn't do.
How do the parties kind of map onto the political spectrum? Like, can you say that like every conservative in the conservative parties is going to vote for Trump, and like everyone in the progressive party would have voted for Kamala? Independent party, is a split, something down the middle. How does that last?
So I think it'd be fair to say that everyone in the progressive party voted for Kamala, but in general, though, I don't think you can paint super broad strokes with the different parties. Certainly, like within the Tory party, we have a lot of, I would say, close to a split on like pro-Trump, anti-Trump. Mm-hmm. And like the anti-Trump people are coming at it from a place of conservatism, just like of a different kind. And so I think, speaking about the other parties, specifically with the parties on the right, I think that's kind of a pretty common thing where you have like a spectrum of kind of political belief within the parties, and I think there's a lot of overlap where like certainly the most like left in the party of the right or something else would kind of overlap with the most right in some of the other ones.
How about in the feds, John?
Yeah, I think his characterization is mostly correct. I think like on the left, on the party of the left and progressive party, I would be shocked to like find a single Trump voter. But in the Federalist Party, or what I presume to be in other conservative parties as well, is that there's a pretty even split among Republican, Democrat voters. And I think that stems more from disagreement on policy and empirical data points rather than like a political philosophy or values disagreement.
How about the independent party?
Yeah, I think the independent party definitely like skewed more Harris, but we had like 2 or 3 Trump supporters. But I thought that was generally the case across Union, actually, is that there's a lot of the conservatives are actually anti-Trump conservatives. So look at the Conservative Party, for example. There's a lot of people who vote straight ticket Democrat, but like are conservative. But I think that speaks to like sort of a larger phenomenon, and that a lot of the conservatives on campus are like conservative on campus, but not necessarily maybe like right wing on like a national scale.
I will say though, I wouldn't necessarily count the Conservative Party as like what you would consider all conservatives to be, because their name is a little deceiving in that like most of them would actually probably disagree with the Burkean version of conservatism, or like a lot of other versions of conservatism that one could articulate, and would like outwardly just like agree as being like anti-conservative.
So how do they pitch themselves as conservatives? Like, what's their understanding of who they are as a group?
Well, I think they value the tradition of their party more than like what their name actually means, and the historical conservative party, which they tried to revive, like was actually conservative, and so they kept the name and then just started admitting people who liked that style of debate, which is like very philosophically grounded, where they'll like name philosophers and like talk very deeply about those subjects, but it's not necessarily the case that they all agree on like conservatism.
Interesting. Does anyone in the Conservative Party find it odd that they're not conservative in like the modern understanding?
I think you would have to ask them. I can say that I think they kind of see the name as a little bit of an inconvenience almost for their like recruitment and their organization, because it is like they certainly take people all over the political spectrum, because they're much more like pretty much every debate is going to have it's going to be philosophical in nature, whereas most of the parties kind of do a blend of more specific political debates and more philosophical debates. So I think they probably view the name as maybe antiquated, even if I had to guess how they view it, but I can't say for certain.
John?
Yeah, if you look on LinkedIn, a lot of them will like put the Optimade Society instead of the Conservative Party because they don't want to necessarily.
Optimade?
Yes, because they don't want to necessarily appear as conservatives or like make people have that impression. So they like rename their society when they add it to their LinkedIn experience.
So this brings to mind something else that you guys had mentioned before we started about Bill Buckley and where he was in the YPU, and apparently Abhi has very evolved thoughts on this, and he's laughing a little bit. We pulled stuff together. You could talk us through that.
So the Yale Political Union was founded in 1934. Okay, so it was founded in 1934 with three original parties. One of those original parties was the Conservative Party. So William F. Buckley was in the Conservative Party that was founded in 1934. But the Conservative Party that was founded in 1934, in 1977, changed its name to the Independent Party. Mm-hmm. So it's just like we just changed our name, but like we kept our same sort of like the same party essentially. And then in 1996, some like random dude was like, "Oh, I'm gonna like restart the Conservative Party," and said like, "I have claim to everything before me." But then that's like, in my opinion, a bad argument, because like if I'm like in like Kenya and I say I am the United States of America, George Washington was my first president, like that's not a good argument to like say that like I'm more of the United States of America than the United States of America.
John?
Yeah.
I will say though, the change of the Conservative Party's name to the Independent Party did represent like an actual shift in the people who made up the party and like the way they did things, which I would now say like the Independent Party, after visiting it, doesn't really debate in the same amount of seriousness and formal style as they used to, which is why I think like the Conservative Party tried to refound that so they could like adhere to their like more silly traditions. And like, I've heard they take like an hour before the actual debate starts just to like do a bunch of traditions and have like just follow those things. But basically the point is like the Conservative Party, like they thought the Independent Party had like left that, and they were trying to like let that happen again.
Yeah, but then they claim our alumni, which is like I think a completely different story. Which I would generally agree with that. The modern Conservative Party has at least modeled the aesthetics of the old Conservative Party, but maybe not the rigor. That's what I said. But that's my party hate.
So when you guys are at the YPU, how much of the YPU is like actual debating versus just like hanging out with friends, right? How much of this is a debate society versus like a frat, like a intellectualized frat life?
I think there's a lot of like overlap, and certainly in the Tory party, maybe even more so than others, where like the debates largely are social events. Like, so like, you know, hearing someone's speech is kind of like an opportunity to kind of catch up with them. People like tell stories. Not everything is completely on topic. Every speech has like a broad theme related to the topic. But so I think that it's kind of like there's not a super clear line there where it's like debate can actually be social, you know, done in a certain way. And certainly, you know, having it be not competitive, not scored, you know, people that fall on different sides of things rarely become too impassioned, although this certainly does happen. I think the debates are like largely social in nature, and of course we have dinners and lunches and other social events.
Yeah, so one thing I was going to ask before and forgot, the names, right? We were talking about the Conservative Party, the Independent Party, but like the Tories, like what's that about?
Yeah, so it's kind of, there's quite a bit of history there between like the Tory Party and the Party of the Right, where I don't want to recite it because I may get some of it wrong, but essentially there was a first Tory Party from like 1954, and then there was like the Party of the Right, and then the Party of the Right joined the Tory Party and became like the Tory Party, Party of the Right, and then that organization renamed itself as the Party of the Right. And then later on in 1969, a group of people broke off from the Party of the Right and they revived the Tory Party name. Unlike the Conservative Party, we do not claim alumni or to be institutionally the same as the 1954 Tory Party. But anyways, and so the idea of it is that we're more grounded in like Burkean conservatism, and it's also just kind of an aesthetic, like a general interest in Britain and like the early history of the United States. So,
but you're not like monarchists. You don't want to like rejoin the British Empire.
Most of us don't.
Most of us don't.
I do not, but we have been known to have a monarchist member. It's good to have one or two at any given time, I would say.
So John, you're part of the Federalists. Like, do you guys trace your ideological heritage back to like early America?
Yeah, so I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think there's actually like a good amount of people in the Federalist Party who might not consider themselves like Federalists, as in like wanting to give a lot of power to the states. But I will say our history is similar to the Tory Party in that we broke off from the Tory Party in 2010 because we didn't think the Tory Party had fixed all the issues after breaking off from the Party of the Right. And we basically accused them more or less of like discriminating against Catholics, which was the main issue, where some of them wouldn't necessarily admit them to the Tory Party. So half of the Tory Party broke off and formed the Federalist Party and added on like the requirement that you do indeed have to like definitely be Burkean conservative, which the Tory Party didn't have, and also that not a necessary requirement, but that you should be more of a like virtuous and nice person.
I think we're virtuous and nice people.
I agree with that. I didn't mean to paint it as if you weren't, but it's necessarily that like no one's going to like discriminate against another person.
But I'm sure the audience can surmise that there is some rivalry between the parties. Certainly those that broke off from each other. I believe it's actually in the POR charter that they destroy the Tory Party. It's like a long-term goal of theirs.
In a sense, there's like, it sounds like there's like decades of like gripes and like bad blood between the different parties.
And we have all of us have alumni banquets every year, so we get all the stories. We all kind of know the background, I would say.
But it makes it fun. It makes it a little fun, because it's like, okay, come on. Like at the end of the day, it's like, oh, we're like student club, whatever. But then it's like, oh, we like make up these like fake rivalries and these like fake elections and like.
John? I don't know. It sounded pretty real when John was talking about the virtuous people. Or whatever.
Well, yes, but we're also like, I try to be friends with all the members of all the other parties, and I think like we all get along very well. Yeah. It's just more of a rivalry in spirit.
It's like a sports rivalry. Like you don't actually hate the other. Well, I mean, some people take it that far, but like you don't actually hate the other team.
Exactly.
Like, it's fun to talk about how
some
bad
people do take it too far, but. Yeah.
So I do want to like look at the YPU in the broader context of the campus. It's interesting because the YPU, I think, has 7 parties. 4 of them are conservative parties. 2 stated liberal parties, and there's the Independent Party. The campus is nowhere near that, right? If you were to poll the campus, and I think the YDN did that, and 86% of Yale students identified as very or somewhat left-leaning. Buckley's own data has 77% of the faculty is Democrat versus 3% conservative, or 3% Republican. So why does YPU have such a strong representation, or like a disproportionately large representation of conservatives? Abhi?
I think maybe it's like one, the aesthetics, but I think the other thing is like conservatives don't have as many places to engage in this type of thing as opposed to like liberals and like Democrats and leftists who have like, for example, like Yale Dems actually meets on Tuesdays, like the same time as YPU. So I think it was like sort of founded, I think, as like a place for these sort of people to have like a safe place to like actually talk about these issues. But also I just think that like the left doesn't have as much of a reason to sort of like go here. It isn't like a unique space for them, if that makes sense.
John?
I will say, though, I think the split between Republicans and Democrats is probably pretty similar to Yale's campus, and that, like, the members of the Yale Political Union being more, like, intellectually and politically minded, they would consider them, like, the word conservative to mean something different than most people on Yale's campus who would just align it with the Republican Party. And so in that way, you would find more conservatives in the union, but it's probably actually pretty split, maybe slightly favoring conservatism for the reasons Abhi mentioned, though.
So, yeah, Will, I'll ask this question to you. Like, what are the numbers breakdowns of the parties, kind of in context of this question, right? Are the two parties on the left, do they have more people than, like, the individual parties on the right, or how does that work?
So I'd say all the parties range in size from about, like, 30 to 50 members. I don't know, maybe the IP has more than 50, but there's not huge. It was a situation in the past that some parties would really dominate the union and have membership that maybe was up to like almost half of the union in a single party. Fortunately, that's not really the case anymore. There is like differences in size, but in general, the parties on the right do have like a much larger membership, given that there's 4 of them, than the parties on the left. But certainly as far as like unaffiliated members that visit union, tend to be on the left. And so the actual like union debates have maybe more of an even split than like the party membership would lead one to believe.
I would also say that a general trend in the sort of past 3 years I've been here has been like this consistent notion of the left being like flailing in union, in the sense there are only 2 parties who it's like varied like how much they have been committed in these past couple of years, but largely they haven't been the most committed members to union. And like the IP has like left and right, so it's like an even split down the middle, even though we are the largest party. So like I would say like that is actually a problem like in the past couple of years. Has been the sort of like failure to get the left more and more engaged with union.
It's an interesting question, because you kind of mentioned that conservatives have like nowhere else to go, hypothetically. You mentioned how, college Democrats meets the same night, or Yale Democrats. Yale Republicans just reformed. I guess I don't know how long they've been out, but they just reformed last fall. Will, you want to start us off? Like, do you think that dynamic plays here, that conservatives feel like they don't have anywhere else to go to talk about conservatism and hang out with people who won't, look at them side-eye before being conservative?
So I certainly think that's a big part of it. Like coming to Yale as a conservative, you kind of understand that that's more unique, and so you want to naturally kind of search out opportunities to engage with people that like agree with you broadly, and so I think a lot of people kind of come to the political union like with that in mind, because there isn't that many other places to go. One of the few others being the Buckley Institute itself, of which like the vast majority of political union members, certainly on the right, are members as well. And then like on the left side, the example I would give, obviously I love the political union. I'm a party chairman, so I'm always like, but I have many, friends on the left through all sorts of other different things at Yale that I do, and I always suggest people like, oh, go visit the Progressive Party, because they're pretty similar to the Tory Party, and I think they're a lot of fun. So I tell people to go over there, and they're just like, I don't want to do I don't want to do the political union. I mean, they're like, oh, they want to do things that are like action oriented, I guess, more so than just kind of discussion oriented. And so I think for people on the left, that's kind of maybe what pulls them away from union, is there's opportunities to do things that are more like action oriented versus more discussion or intellectual.
John?
Yeah, I think that's mostly right. I will say with like the rise of the Buckley Institute, it does seem that there is becoming more conservatives who just go to the Buckley Institute without being a member of the political union. I think on the board of the Institute, most of us are members of some party or another, but like there seems to be, from who I've met, a lot of fellows of Buckley who are not members of the Yale Political Union or like barely go to debates.
Robbie?
Yeah. Just quickly on the left thing again. I think one of the problems also is that there is an intolerance there as well, I think. Is that like I think the left is also sometimes like unwilling to engage with the right. But there's also a perception that union isn't the safest space for the left. Which I think is like sometimes true, but not all the time true.
Can you just explain that a little more? What's the thing? What do people think?
So, I mean, there's like, for example, like, so one of the most common complaints is like misgendering from the left, is that like, oh, union's a space for misgendering, or they think that like certain takes by like the guests themselves are like sort of like unworthy of engaging with, sort of. So I do think that like some of it is an intolerance from like actually the left, but I do wonder if like union itself also has like space to improve to make it a sort of better like space for discourse, which has been sort of part of the larger union conversation for the past couple of years. But I think it's gotten a bit better.
But John, the kind of dynamic that he talked about, like, do you see that, feel that, or you think it's like, from your perspective, like things are perfectly welcoming and normal? How do you feel, or do you understand where he's coming from, or those people who make those complaints are coming from?
For Abhi's point on how the left handles like the right, I will say that I think like the left responds worse to like the right giving like a speech in favor of their positions than the right does to the left. I've noticed, for example, at the Al Sharpton debate, a member of the party of the right gave a speech in which a lot of like the members of the left were just like laughing at various points during the speech, when that really like never happens on the right side. We don't just like laugh at their points.
I think you've just been in union like far less than you'll see. For example, like the PR is like notorious for exactly this sort of type of thing. It's like they'll sit at the front and like they'll be right in front of the speaker, and it'll be like a first year like on the left that goes to speak. The entire speech they'll be hissing, and then they'll like misgender the like first year, and then they'll like laugh at the first year's take. Right? Like I wouldn't say that like this is unique to like. I agree. Like the left isn't like great at this, but I'm just saying is that like maybe like the right also has like some sort of problems as well.
Yeah, this could be true. I haven't been to that many debates yet because I'm only a freshman, so I haven't witnessed much. But from what I've witnessed, I have seen that maybe the party of the right doesn't necessarily fit like the stereotype that people described it to the full extent. It does to somewhat. I haven't seen anyone misgender anyone. I have seen like a few people like laughing at speakers, but not to the same extent that I've seen it at recent debates from the left.
Sure. Yeah. So like I remember you mentioned at the beginning, it was like, oh, like you sort of like look for this sort of like intellectual like disagreement, like ideological disagreement at union and not necessarily like within the party. Like the reason why I think that the party itself is like such a good, like that's why I like the IP, is that like union can be sort of like stilted and stifling in some places, and that like there are like 5 student speeches and like you get maybe a couple questions. You don't really know who the person is exactly. It isn't as like communal as like a party debate is, to like you don't know the person, you haven't built the trust to like actually like interrogate this person. So I feel like one of the other problems is that like union as a space isn't the most like cohesive, I would say, is that like the fact that we are in our own parties makes it less of a sort of space where we can be rigorous and actually ask the tough questions and engage with each other genuinely, because we don't actually all know each other like that well, even though some of us know each other.
So we don't have a lot of time left, so I want to wrap up with this question. I mean, at Buckley, we talk a lot about the ability of students on campus to have conversations with people who disagree, and that's come up a bit during the discussion. So I'm just curious, from your perspective, do you think YPU helps with that dynamic? Do you think people who are involved in YPU are better at having those kind of tough discussions? Do you think it makes no difference? Do you think it might make people worse at it? Will?
So I think I can, kind of say that the Yale Political Union was actually one of the big reasons that I chose to come to Yale, because I thought that it was something that was very unique, and that was kind of what I was looking for, was the opportunity to have a space to discuss freely with people these kind of topics, including like controversial topics, and having a place where people are like prepared to have mature and like thoughtful conversations about things. And I think that's absolutely what I found, and I've been very grateful to have the opportunity to engage with it. And I think that, unfortunately, the political union's like place on campus is not what it has always been historically. So the impact on the campus at large might be a little just diminished based off of that. But in general, though, I think that it is very impactful to like have that space. And I think, if I were to tally up, what I've learned from being at Yale, and I were to say like how much comes from the classes, how much has come from like the political union and like engagements there, and the Tory party and all that, I think it would probably be much a closer split than you would think.
Abhi?
Yeah, I think that like union is like sort of like not the ideal, but like sort of it gives hope for what like Yale's campus can be sort of in discourse. But like at the end of the day, there are like 200 members total, right? Like 50 of them are like on the left and the rest are like on the right, sort of. And like that's sort of like the like sad part is that like there are only like 50 people like on the left taking part in this. And this isn't like sort of like reminiscent of like a larger there has been a change in larger campus culture. I think probably a regression in campus culture since like the old YPU days in terms of like this type of discourse. So I do think like YPU itself helps, but like it's like is only helps to like 50 people, I would say. Yeah.
So I mean, I do think, yeah, the decline of the union is like a whole nother topic to broach that I guess we don't have the time to do. But I think a lot of it comes from like the institutional priority and like the administration of Yale. As far as the union used to have a permanent debate location, it used to have offices. All these kind of things have been taken away by the Yale administration. It's just not something that they seem to really prioritize. I mean, student groups in general, but certainly the Yale Political Union as like an important part of like the Yale experience, an important part of the campus discourse, as I wish that they would, as I wish that they still did. And I think that that's, you know, part of the reason it's good to have the Buckley Institute is that to have like a well-resourced organization that's kind of looking out for these same kind of things that maybe the administration allowing the decline of the YPU has left like kind of a gap, I think, in the campus. So.
All right. Well, thank you for all your thoughts. It was a great discussion. You know, John, Will, Abhi, thanks for joining me on Pod a Minute Yale.
Thank you, Aaron.
Yes,
Thanks
thank you for having us.
And now on to our interview with independent journalist and Yale alum Jamie Kirchick, talking about the state of modern journalism and what's causing it to go off the rails. So I'd like to welcome to the podcast James Kirchick. Jamie is a contributing writer to Tablet Magazine, a writer at large for Airmail, and author of the instant New York Times bestseller Secret City, The Hidden History of Gay Washington. He's the author of The End of Europe, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age. Jamie is a senior fellow at FIRE, has reported from over 40 countries. His work has appeared in numerous outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and The Atlantic, among others. He graduated from Yale in 2006. Thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to talk to you about today is discourse and debate on our college campuses more generally and at Yale too. You've been out of Yale for a few years. You've remained connected and involved, and we'll go into that more later. What's your sense of the political and intellectual environment on campus these days?
Well, it seems a lot more constricted than it was when I was there. When I was at Yale, the YPU had many members, hundreds of members. And there were very vigorous debates across the political spectrum. I don't recall a speaker ever being shouted down when I was at Yale. There were protests, certainly, but there was never really an attempt to actually, physically stop or prevent a controversial speaker from speaking. And on those two issues, it seems that the things have gone in a bad direction, and that there's less debates going on between people of different opinions. That people are sort of cocooned into their ideological corners, and it does seem that controversial speakers, always on the center right or dissident left, however or right wing. There seem to be much fiercer challenges to them. And it does seem that there are outrages are caused over relatively minor, issues of expression, like the infamous, Halloween costume debate of 10 years ago. That was something that would have been unimaginable when I was at Yale, and I had graduated only 9 years before that incident occurred. So it does not seem very auspicious to me, although I'm not on the campus, so it's hard for me to say.
So you work in this kind of free speech world, right? As independent journalists who work on these issues. You work at FIRE. Free speech is something you've been talking about for a very long time throughout your career. When you talk to other journalists who talk about the college campuses, when you're talking to other people at FIRE, what is the sense they have of the campuses? Is it this similar kind of what's going on? Do they see it differently? Do they have other concerns?
Oh, well, I don't want to speak for FIRE, but you can look at their website and read their reports. It's obviously a real I mean, they refer to it as a free speech crisis on university campuses, and university campuses really are some of the most restrictive places when it comes to free expression, which is terrible because the university is supposed to be a place of open engagement and intellectual inquiry. And so, the ratings that fire issues every year on certain institutions, certain schools are, quite depressing when you look into them. And it's often, the more elite and prestigious the school is, the worse it is when it comes to free expression. And so that really disturbs me because I can tell you, having been a professional journalist for almost 20 years now, we've definitely noticed that the younger people coming into this industry have a completely separate or different idea of what journalism is, what it should be, what free expression means. I mean, when I was coming up in this business, I'm center right. There are people on the far left. We would have, huge arguments about any political issue, but we tended to agree that, we should be allowed to say what we think, and people should not be shut down or criminally penalized for their speech. And over the course of, the past 18, 20 years, I saw the younger people coming into my industry had a completely different set of values. And they thought it was the role of journalists, not to report the truth, but to report their version of the truth that made their particular side look better. They viewed it as their job to basically ignore or attack opposing views rather than giving them a hearing. And I think that has really transformed journalism for the worse. I mean, there was really a period, I think, from 2015 to until very recently, when mainstream American journalism was really transformed for the worse. And you've seen in response to that, there's been this rise of all this alternative forms of media, the rise of podcasts, the rise of Substack, and all the many publications across the political spectrum that are on Substack. And there's a lot good about that. I listen to a lot of those podcasts. I read a lot of those Substacks. But there are negative consequences as well, because you get a lot of fringe voices are now more popular. And they're, like InfoWars, right, or Alex Jones. And the reason why people are listening to these is because they don't trust the mainstream media anymore. And so they're much more susceptible to believing in conspiracy theories, or just to not accept anything that the mainstream media says. And, the mainstream media is usually right, okay? They're usually reporting the facts. But there have been major stories, major themes that they've gotten wrong over the years and that they've refused to apologize for. And for that reason, a lot of people just don't trust them. And I don't think that they're necessarily wrong to be more suspicious, at least, or more skeptical of the mainstream media. And just, there are benefits and downsides to that development.
So you talked about two different dynamics in your last answer. One is the younger people coming into journalism who have a different outlook on what journalism should be. And this response, and separately but somewhat related perhaps, is this response of the American public to major incidents where the media got things wrong and refused to apologize for, and the result that they go to alternative media. Is there some connection between the two? Do you think they feed into each other, feed off of each other?
Oh, absolutely. And I think you saw it a lot during the Trump administration. When, Donald Trump, who I never voted for, and I'm a strong critic of, he would obviously say a lot of false things and continues to do so. And I always thought that the role of the media should be just to report that and just to report what he says. And if he says something wrong, to point out why he's wrong. That's the role of journalists. And that seemed to me like it would have been sufficient in portraying the reality that we're dealing with. But unfortunately, it came to the point where he might say something true and they would report it as being false, or they would exaggerate, or they would, as one reporter said, they would take him literally and not seriously, right? He might say something that was basically true, but he would exaggerate it and they would call him a fascist or whatever. They would overreact to his lies and evasions. But then there were major stories that the mainstream media screwed up. The primary one being the whole Russiagate scandal, right? This whole notion that Donald Trump was recruited by the KGB in 1987 and had colluded with the Russian government to steal the 2016 election, and that he was basically a Russian agent. And this was the mainstream media narrative for years. And they were able to convince practically, half the country, like blue America, believed this. They believed that Donald Trump was, suborned by the KGB 35 years ago.
I think some still do, yeah.
And many of them still do, not just some, many of them still do. And there has not to this day really been an apology from the journalists and the institutions that push that narrative. And I think that did enormous damage, not only on journalism and the respect and the trust that people have for journalists, but it did a lot of damage to our political discourse. And we're still living with that today. And so, something like that, or something like the COVID lab leak theory, which is probably now not a theory, it's probably true. But when Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, raised the possibility that COVID might have escaped from a Chinese lab rather than being some, naturally born virus coming out of a wet market, he was vilified as a racist, by the mainstream media, by the leaders of the Democratic Party. And it should have been, it seemed, at least this should have been at least a legitimate point of inquiry, okay, given that there was a laboratory working on coronaviruses in this region. So it should have not been some crazy idea. It seemed from the very beginning, that's probably a good thesis we might want to examine. But again, because the media was so dead set on opposing not only Trump, but conservatives, that they had to oppose anything that they said and portray it wrong. And I can go through so many examples of this. It happens every day. I see it every day. There are, little examples where they might, refer to something with very loaded language. But it's almost always going in one side, right? You hardly ever see this sort of treatment being given to the left or liberal politicians or figures in the mainstream media. It's almost always going in one direction. And that's why conservatives don't trust the mainstream media. And that's why increasingly a lot of independents and people in the middle don't trust the mainstream media either.
So what's the fix for that? Is it just the mainstream media outlets need to just take responsibility for that and decide, we're just, regardless of how it affects our ratings, we're going to just, report things straight, drop the loaded language? Like what's the path forward?
Well, I think it is up to the mainstream media outlets. And I think it would help their ratings, frankly, because they've been losing ratings, with the exception of the New York Times, all the mainstream media has basically been plummeting over the past 10 years. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that they are perceived as biased. And you only have to look at the polls. I'm forgetting which polling firm it was, Gallup or one of the others. It has shown that, trust in mainstream media has declined precipitously. And it's something like 20 or 25% now. Same for higher education. It's same for most American institutions, with the exception of the military, have seen these precipitous drops. And so, yes, I do think it is up to leaders in these media institutions to, stop bowing down to the 25-year-olds who work for them and are demanding all these radical changes, to, grow a backbone, grow a spine, and bring back these older traditional, small L liberal values that once informed mainstream media. Look, the mainstream media has always been left of center. I think that's probably impossible to change, because the types of people who go into mainstream media tend to be liberal. They don't tend to be, they are almost exclusively liberal. If you were to look at the party registrations of the people who work at the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, overwhelmingly Democrat registered. But it didn't used to be this bad in terms of coverage and the bias of their coverage. It did not used to be this bad. And I think there was an overreaction to Donald Trump, because he was, frankly, a very surprising, strange, unconventional, unorthodox, to use, light language
Right.
figure when he arrived on the scene in 2015. And I count myself among those people, among those journalists who did not understand what was happening in the country. I could not comprehend how, a television game show host basically was becoming president of the United States. And we reached for all different sorts of excuses, right? That it was racism, it was Russia, it was, fascism. People didn't believe in democracy anymore. And, I don't believe any of those anymore, because I've, been living and reading and traveling out and talking to people. And I realized that my impressions at the time were uninformed. And I do think that the mainstream media is making efforts to move back in a more unbiased, neutral perspective. I don't think the coverage now is nearly as bad as it was in 2017.
Right.
I think that the media is covering him more scrupulously. There's much less alarmism about what's going on. And they're actually doing a pretty good job now, I would say.
Do you think are there outlets that, stand out to you? I think I've noticed it also. I mean, you saw like some of the response to Trump's re-election was also more muted, and whether that's because, once is a fluke, twice, I think maybe it wasn't an accident or it wasn't a trick. But it does seem, like you said, like there are people who are still saying, democracy is over tomorrow.
Right.
It does seem like the media outlets in general aren't quite as hyperbolic as they used to.
Yeah.
Are there some you think have done better that you would encourage people maybe give this outlet or that outlet a second look, or maybe on this issue, that issue are worth reading?
Well, I mean, I'm biased because I write for them, but I do think the Times has actually done quite a good job in covering Trump measuredly. I think the Wall Street Journal has been particularly exceptional, frankly, and just all around, I think that they've been one of the best media outlets in covering Trump and, frankly, the world from a non-ideological perspective. I don't watch television news, so it's hard for me to say. I don't watch network news.
Right, like Fox or CNN.
Well, no, network, ABC, CBS, ABC. I don't watch the networks. Cable news, I don't consider that news. I consider it entertainment. So I don't watch. I mean, I think Fox is actually the Fox News division, not the opinion. Like the evening shows are, they're all in Trump's favor, obviously. But I actually think that the Fox News coverage tends to be certainly better than MSNBC or CNN, which are basically part of the resistance and have been. And that's what they are. And as long as you go into it understanding that, NBC is not a news network, it is a propaganda outlet for the Democratic Party. Fine. I mean, it's, that's allowed. This is a free country. You can have that. But just don't. You just have to understand that MSNBC is not a news network in the traditional definition of the term.
So I want to bring it back to the campus, bring a discussion back to the campus, and that kind of poor state of discourse. You mentioned earlier in the discussion that it wasn't quite as bad when you were on campus, when you were at Yale. Was it easier to have kind of like those discussions between people with different opinions? Like, could conservatives and liberals talk to each other? Were conservatives more confident in speaking up when you were undergrad?
Well, certainly in the YPU, and I was in the Independent Party, so right in the middle. And look, every week we got together and we had a guest, and it was always a controversial issue, and the debates were spirited, but they were civil, and people had friendships across the political aisle. Each party had their own debate every week, and you would see members of the Liberal Party might come to a Tory party debate and vice versa. So that seemed okay to me. And, look, outside the YPU, were there oftentimes harsh disagreements politically? Absolutely. I mean, when I was a student, the major issues of the day were the Iraq War and the labor situation on campus. And there was a lot of tension around those issues. There was a lot of protests. There were, speakers might be invited to campus and would be shouted down. There would be demonstrations to disrupt the talks. But I don't really recall myself ever getting into like a shouting match or like screaming at somebody or being screamed at. It's hard for me to. There might have been one or two incidents around a protest, maybe when there were counter protests and people were kind of, yelling back and forth at each other. But nothing like what we saw with the Kostakis episode.
So, do you have a last question? As we're coming to the end of time here. Do you have any hope for the future of America's elite campuses?
Well, I have hope in the sense that it seems like a lot of the younger people now, like not the ones who were there, not the like younger millennials, I guess, or the ones who were at colleges in the 2010s. They're like the lost generation. It seems more people your age, the Gen Z, people just coming out of university. They seem to have their head on their shoulders much better, and they seem to be more resistant or skeptical of a lot of the kind of woke agenda. In the same way that, any young person looks at what is the mainstream or what's authority, they tend to look at it with rebellion, right? They want to rebel against it. They question it. And it seems that, your generation is looking at kind of the woke liberal establishment and is, questioning that and not falling for everything that you're told. But as for the institutions themselves, I'm very pessimistic. I don't see how they can get themselves out of this rut, barring, something like the federal government stepping in or a massive decline in applications. Well, I also think the fact, we'll have to see, will the corporate sector, will the private sector stop giving preference to kids from Ivy League schools? I've never been in a position to hire someone, but it would have been that it used to have been the case that I would have given preference to someone who went to Yale or a top tier Ivy League school. I can't say that anymore. I would be skeptical of someone coming into my office asking for a job if they came from one of these institutions, frankly. I would be more inclined to interview someone coming from a state school.
Well, with that sobering thought, I appreciate you joining us on Pod and Man at Yale. Appreciate your insight about,
Not any alumni of the Buckley program, obviously.
Well, all of our Buckley fellows, I think about 800 now. I'll be happy to hear that.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your time and your thoughts. So thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you.
There's another great episode of Pod and Man at Yale. Why do you think debate is disappearing on campus and around the country? Let us know by commenting on our YouTube channel or email us your thoughts at info@buckleyinstitute.com. And always remember, for God, for country, and for Yale, in that order.